Hollywood loves sequels because sequels are safe. They come with a built-in audience, familiar characters, and the promise of doing the same thing again, only bigger. But what happens when bigger becomes worse? Occasionally, a sequel doesn't just underperform or disappoint, it actively damages the franchise it belongs to. When that happens, studios don't apologize or explain themselves. Instead, they erase history. We're going to look at 10 sequels so destructive that Hollywood quietly pretended they never happened. Hollywood rarely admits mistakes, but it often corrects them retroactively. When a sequel undermines a brand, the solution is not explanation, but reconstruction. Entire timelines are rewritten, entries quietly excluded, and history reshaped until only the profitable memories remain. These movies just didn't fail, but were gradually removed from cultural relevance by design.
McLeod. You created that monstrosity? Why?
Few sequels have so completely detonated their own mythology as Highlander II: The Quickening. The original Highlander built a mysterious fantasy world populated by immortal sword fighters bound by ancient, almost spiritual rules. The sequel discards all that in its opening act by revealing that the immortals are actually aliens from the planet Zeist, exiled to Earth as punishment. Connor McLeod, who ended the first film as a mortal, is suddenly old, then young again, battling other aliens exiles in a bleak future where Earth is covered by an artificial ozone shield. This radical shift was not the result of creative inspiration, but chaos behind the scenes. Financial problems with international backers caused budgets to collapse mid-production, forcing sweeping changes to the script. Characters were rewritten, scenes were excised, and post-production attempted to salvage coherence through awkward dubbing and narration. The result alienated fans instantly and confused critics, who responded with near universal disdain. The backlash was so severe that the director publicly disowned the theatrical cut. Instead of defending the film, the franchise erased it. Later Highlander sequels revert completely to the original mythology, behaving as though the Quickening never occurred. It remains one of the rare cases where a sequel is not merely ignored by fans, but actively rejected by the franchise itself.
He's mine. He's chosen me. Pazuzu's Reagan is the only Reagan.
Following The Exorcist was always going to be dangerous, the original film terrified audiences by grounding supernatural horror in realism and restraint. The Exorcist II rejected that approach entirely. Rather than demonic horror, the film pursued abstract concepts involving shared hallucinations, experimental hypnosis devices, psychic connections, and philosophical debates about evil. Reagan returns as a teenager, but possession becomes something almost clinical and detached from fear. Audiences were blindsided. What they expected was terror, what they received was confusion. Critics described the film as self-indulgent, detached, and baffling unscary. The sequel's failure was so profound that its mere existence became a problem of the series. When Exorcist III was released in 1990, it acted as if the second film did not exist, restoring tone, continuity, and narrative focus back to the original. That erasure continues today. Modern Exorcist sequels and reboots consistently refer only to the 1973 film, quietly treating the Heretic as a creative misstep, best left outside the canon.
I want to propose a toast to a nice guy who's about to finish last.
Superman 4: The Quest for Peace is a textbook case of ambition destroyed by circumstances. The film attempted to tackle nuclear disarmament during the final years of the Cold War, positioning Superman as a global moral authority who physically removes nuclear weapons from the world. The concept was bold, but the execution was crippled by massive budget cuts that left entire scenes unfilmed and visual effects unfinished. The villain, Nuclear Man, was introduced with grand intention but little little credibility. The transitions throughout the film felt abrupt because much of the story literally was missing. Critics noticed immediately. The movie was ridiculed for its cheap effects and incomplete feel, and audiences stayed away. Instead of rehabilitating the franchise, it nearly ended Christopher Reeve's run as Superman. In fact, it did, because that's the last time he played Superman. When Warner Brothers attempted a revival with Superman Returns in 2006, the studio made a decisive move. It declared the film a sequel only to Superman and Superman 2. Parts 3 and 4 were erased without fanfare, quietly removed from the hero's narrative history.
You can't be.
What, Eric? 1 in a billion?
Unlike many sequels, American Psycho 2 was never meant to exist. It began as a completely unrelated thriller script only to have the American Psycho name attached during production. The film opens by retroactively killing Patrick Bateman and replacing him with a new protagonist who aspires to become a killer herself. The biting satire of the original, its commentary on consumerism, masculinity, and identity, is replaced with a conventional uneven thriller. The reaction was swift and unforgiving. Critics dismissed it outright, fans rejected the premise, and the people responsible for the original film publicly distanced themselves from it. Rather than attempting damage control, the studio chose silence. The sequel is rarely mentioned, never integrated, and effectively lives in narrative exile. Its erasure was informal but definitive. American Psycho remains culturally intact because its sequel has been politely forgotten.
Thea! Get down from there! Get down from there!
Mommy lets me.
No, it's too dangerous. Don't do that.
Jaws the Revenge pushed an already strained franchise into absurd territory by suggesting a shark capable of personal vengeance. The film implies deliberate emotional motivation following the Brody family across the ocean, defying geography and logic. What made the original Jaws terrifying, its realism and restraint, was replaced with melodrama and implausibility. The critical response was merciless, and the film quickly became a punchline. Unlike franchises that try again, Universal chose a different path. It stopped entirely. No immediate reboots, no sequels, no expanded universe. Just silence. Over time, Jaws became remembered as a singular masterpiece, with its final sequel fading into infamy through collective forgetting.
Trick or treat, motherfucker.
By the early 2000s, Halloween had already endured multiple continuity resets, but Halloween Resurrection finally snapped the franchise credibility. Opening by killing Laurie Strode just minutes into the film, it pivoted to a reality TV gimmick that followed contestants exploring Michael Myers' childhood home on a live stream. Intended as a modernization, it instead trivialized the franchise's core terror. Stylistically, the film chased trends rather than atmosphere. The climax, featuring Busta Rhymes physically fighting Myers with martial arts moves, became instantly infamous. Critics dismissed the film as ridiculous, and fans treated it as a creative low point. When the franchise was revived in 2018, the studio erased every sequel after the 1978 original. Resurrection vanished along with decades of narrative baggage.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
I gotta go back.
Grease 2 tried to replicate the success of Grease by returning to Rydell High with new characters and reversed gender roles. While energetic and occasionally inventive, it lacked the cultural chemistry that made the first film iconic. On release, it was met with indifference and disappointment, performing poorly at the box office. Though the film later developed a niche cult following, that reassessment never translated into official recognition. Studio branding, stage adaptations, and tributes focus entirely on the original. Grease 2 exists, but outside the cultural memory the studio actively maintains.
Holy shit.
Removing Michael J. Fox from Teen Wolf proved fatal. Teen Wolf 2 followed a distant relative navigating college boxing rather than basketball, using the same underdog with werewolf powers formula. Without Fox's charisma or novelty, the sequel felt redundant almost immediately. Critics were dismissive, audiences were uninterested, and the film faded quickly. When the franchise was revived through MTV's Teen Wolf, the sequel was never referenced. The reboot quietly re-anchored the franchise around the original alone. Reviving the Blues Brothers without John Belushi was an impossible task, disguised as optimism. Blues Brothers 2000 repeated the road trip formula, featuring numerous iconic musicians, but lacked the anarchic charm and chemistry that defined the original. Critics and fans felt the film misunderstood what made the first movie work. Despite respectable musical performances, the sequel was widely seen as unnecessary. Over time, the pop culture talk of the Blues Brothers froze entirely around the 1980 original, with the sequel rarely acknowledged.
Why did you turn down Speed 2?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. And Speed 2, yeah, at the time...
I was wondering if there was anything in your career that you haven't forgiven yourself for, a role you didn't take, a take you wish you had done one more time, a character choice you wish you had made. Is there anything in your career that you're still having a hard time letting go of?
Yes, Speed 2.
I didn't respond to the script. I really wanted to work with Sandra Bullock, and I just, I really loved playing Jack Traven,
I like Speed 2.
What?
I like Speed 2. It's different than Speed 1, but it's not.
Was brave. That was brave to admit, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
I love Speed, and it was like, okay, a bus, okay, we're going, but now it's on an ocean liner. Yeah. Speed ocean liner.
Thank you. So maybe I should reflect on why I can't forgive myself, and maybe go back and watch and see the benefits of it. Yeah.
At that time, I'm sure we've all had this kind of feeling sometimes when things just don't feel right, and that was how I was feeling.
And it was almost like in real life you were dodging a bullet. So that's good.
No.
Speed succeeded because it was simple, relentless, and fast. Speed 2 removed all three elements. Without Keanu Reeves and set aboard a slow-moving cruise ship, the sequel replaced urgency with spectacle. The villain, a disgruntled hacker, lacked menace, and the set pieces felt bloated rather than tense. The film was expensive, poorly reviewed, and commercially disappointing. No attempt was made to continue the franchise. Over time, Speed became a one-movie legacy, with its sequel effectively erased by reputation alone. Erasing sequels is not about artistic integrity, it's about brand survival. Hollywood reshapes history to preserve what audiences love and quietly bury what threatens that affection. These films were not erased because they failed, but because they succeeded in the wrong way. They made people rethink why they liked the originals at all. And in Hollywood, that is the greatest sin a sequel can commit. Sequels don't disappear by accident. When a studio pretends part of a franchise never happened, that decision is rarely emotional or artistic. It's strategic. It's rooted in how Hollywood understands brands, nostalgia, and audience memory, and in how franchises have quietly transformed from stories into modular products. By the time a sequel is erased, the damage has already been assessed. The math has been run, and the conclusion is clear. Remembering this movie costs more than forgetting it. To understand why Hollywood erases sequels, you have to stop thinking about movies as stories and start thinking about them as evolving commercial ecosystems. In earlier eras of filmmaking, sequels were extensions of stories. Continuity mattered because it was assumed audiences were following along, but modern franchises are not primarily about narrative progression, they are about brand reliability. A franchise name functions as a promise, tone, quality, and emotional familiarity. It destabilizes the brand. This is why studios don't simply acknowledge bad sequels and move on. Acknowledgement reinforces memory. Erasure neutralizes it. When Halloween declares that only the 1978 film matters, it's not correcting lore, it's reassuring brand identity. Halloween becomes a stable, digestible product again, a masked killer, a suburban setting, a familiar rhythm. Everything else becomes optional or non-existent. In franchise logic, canon is flexible. Branding is sacred. Fans often argue about canon and if it's a fixed structure. Studios do not. Canon is a lever, a switch that can be flipped on or off depending on its usefulness. If a sequel adds value, it's canon. If it raises awkward questions, it's quietly removed. This explains why certain sequels are selectively remembered. Superman Returns didn't erase all previous films, only the ones that weakened its emotional continuity. Exorcist III didn't reboot the franchise, it reached over Exorcist II and grabbed the original like a life raft. These decisions weren't about storytelling consistency, they were about strategic alignment. The studio asked a simple question: which version of the story do people still trust? Canon, then, is not history, it's brand permission. Every successful movie establishes an emotional contract with its audience. It says, this story made you feel something. We will respect that feeling. A bad sequel breaks that contract retroactively. It creates doubt where there was certainty. Consider Highlander II. Once immortals become aliens, the emotional weight of centuries of swordplay collapses into cheap science fiction. Or Jaws the Revenge, which reframes primal fear as personal vendetta, transforming danger into absurdity. These sequels didn't just disappoint, they rewrote the meaning of the originals in ways audiences rejected. When a sequel recontextualizes an original so badly that people feel embarrassed for having cared, the studio has a problem. Erasing the sequel allows fans to love the original again without cognitive friction. Reboots are often framed as creative reinventions, but many functions as apologies without admitting fault. When a studio says this movie ignores all previous sequels, it is effectively saying those weren't really us. This is why so many modern franchise entries advertise themselves as true sequels or direct continuations. The language deliberate. It invites audiences back to a pre-trauma version of the franchise. 2018 Halloween, Superman Returns, and various Exorcist revivals all perform the same maneuver. They sidestep embarrassment rather than confront it. A reboot doesn't fix the story, it restores trust. Studios understand something uncomfortable. Most audiences don't rewatch whole franchises. They remember impressions, vibes, cultural thumbnails. This allows companies to erase films not by deleting them, but by starving them of reminders. If a movie isn't referenced, marketed, or included in box sets, it fades. Grease 2 still exists, but without affirmation, it floats outside the official memory of Grease. Teen Wolf 2 survives only as trivia. American Psycho 2 remains invisible because the studio never gave audiences permission to remember it. Erasure doesn't require denial, it requires neglect. Not all bad sequels are erased. Some become part of a franchise's mythology because they are safely mockable. But there is a distinction between sequels that are funny bad and sequels that are structurally dangerous. A dangerous sequel undermines the franchise's premise, tone, or thematic core. It doesn't just fail, it confuses what the franchise is. These are the movies studios erase because they damage future entries even more than they harm the present. Speed 2 makes Speed irrelevant. Highlander 2 makes immortality meaningless. Superman 4 makes Superman small. Those are not recoverable within the same continuity. Studios can only erase what audiences are willing to let go. Fan culture plays a crucial role in deciding which sequels survive through irony and which are quietly abandoned. When fans quote a bad sequel affectionately, it remains visible. When fans respond with a collective silence or embarrassment, studios follow their lead. This creates an unspoken agreement. The studio pretends it didn't happen, and fans agree not to bring it up at parties. The past becomes negotiable. Ironically, erasing sequels is something only mature, long-running franchises can afford to do. A small series has its own missteps. A legacy franchise can rewrite itself. Time provides insulation. When a studio erases a sequel, it is not panicking. It is consolidating power. It is saying this brand is bigger than any one movie. The ultimate reality is that franchises are designed to outlive individual entries. Movies age. Brands don't, unless allowed to. Erasing sequels is a way of protecting future value, not past integrity. The tragedy and the fascination lies in what this does to storytelling. Stories are meant to accumulate meaning. Franchises are designed to shed it when inconvenient. When a sequel disappears, it isn't because Hollywood forgot, it's because Hollywood remembered too well. It understood the cost of keeping that movie alive in collective memory and decided silence was cheaper. And somewhere out there on a forgotten DVD rack or streaming algorithm, that erased sequel still exists. Technically canon, practically invisible, waiting for the rare viewer who discovers it and thinks, wait, why does no one talk about this? Because the franchise already moved on. For a long time, Hollywood believed that franchises were immortal. If a sequel failed, it could be erased. If an era collapsed, it could be rebooted. If audiences lost interest, nostalgia could bring them back. This belief shaped decades of modern blockbuster filmmaking and produced an industry that treats stories as renewable resources. But something has changed. The same tools that once repaired broken franchises are no longer working as reliably. Reboots struggle, legacy sequels underperform, nostalgia alone no longer guarantees goodwill. Franchise fatigue is often understood as simple oversaturation, as if audiences are just tired of seeing the same characters too often. That explanation is convenient, but incomplete. The real problem is not quantity, it's predictability without payoff. Audiences are not exhausted by franchises themselves, they are exhausted by the emotional loop. Modern franchises repeatedly ask viewers to feel the same emotions: nostalgia, awe, catharsis, without earning them anew. Each revival promises restoration, but few offer transformation. When every return is framed as the real sequel or a return to form, audiences begin to recognize the pattern. The promise loses power. Enthusiasm becomes cautious. Curiosity becomes indifference. Franchise fatigue is not boredom, it's skepticism. Franchise rehab depends on a fragile contract between studio and audience. Trust us, this time is different. That contract can only be invoked so many times before it collapses. Early rehab successes worked because the damage felt recent and specific. One bad sequel, one misjudged era. A correction felt meaningful. But when franchises undergo multiple cycles of collapse and repair, audiences start to sense manipulation rather than growth. At a certain point, rehab stops signaling humility and starts signaling desperation. Each reset becomes less an apology and more an admission that the franchise no longer knows what it is. Trust, once spent, cannot be endlessly renewed. Nostalgia is not a permanent resource. It is a memory amplifier, and like all amplifiers, it loses effectiveness with repetition. Early callback-driven sequels succeed because they reconnect viewers with formatic experiences. Over time, however, those callbacks hardened into formulas. The same musical cue, the same hero poses, the same symbolic objects returned again and again until they stopped evoking emotion and began to feel transactional. Instead of feeling remembered, audiences felt mined. When nostalgia becomes structural rather than contextual, when it exists to replace story rather than support, it accelerates fatigue rather than elevating it. The past stops feeling alive and starts feeling embalmed. One of the most visible signs of franchise fatigue is exhaustion of legacy characters. These figures were initially brought back as bridges between eras, but over time they became crutches. Each return asks us to believe that the character has unfinished business. Each farewell claims finality. Each resurrection undermines the last goodbye. Eventually, the emotional math stops working. Audiences begin to intuit that the character exists less as a person and more as an asset. When that realization sets in, pathos turn into cynicism. The character is no longer a source of comfort, it is a reminder of creative stagnation. Rehab fails when legacy presence substitutes for narrative purpose. When too much of the franchise has to be ignored for the current version to function, the fracture becomes obvious. Audiences begin to ask uncomfortable questions. If none of this mattered, why should I care now? A franchise that constantly disowns its own history trains viewers not to emotionally invest. Why commit if the timeline may be rewritten again next cycle? At this stage, erasure no longer repairs damage, it exposes it. One of the most insidious effects of franchise fatigue is internal competition. When multiple versions, timelines, and tonal experiments coexist, no single iteration feels definitive. Instead Instead of expanding possibilities, the franchise becomes incoherent. New entries are judged less on what they are and more on what they are correcting. Art becomes response. Story becomes repair work. When a franchise is permanently in repair mode, forward momentum stalls. Another structural problem is demographic mismatch. Many franchises are still attempting to emotionally target the audience that first loved them decades ago, while also courting new viewers with incompatible expectations. What once felt universal now feels generationally specific. Nostalgia that resonates powerfully with one group reads as irrelevant to another. Attempting to satisfy both often results in tone compromise, and that satisfies neither. Franchise fatigue emerges when a story refuses to accept that its original moment has passed. Not every franchise collapse is a failure. Sometimes stepping away is the healthiest option. Franchises that endure often do so not because they persist uninterrupted, but because they disappear long enough to be reimagined rather than repaired. True reinvention requires letting go of sacred components, characters, aesthetics, even mythology. Rehab resists this. Rehab seeks recovery. Reinvention accepts loss. Hollywood struggles with this distinction because reinvention risks alienating existing fans, while rehab only risks boring them. Franchise fatigue is not an audience problem, it is a creative one. It signals that a brand has exhausted its ability to evolve within its own constraints. The danger is not that franchises will disappear, the danger is that they will persist in a zombified state, technically alive, culturally inert, endlessly cycling through revival and erasure without growth. At that point, even nostalgia cannot save them. The final truth is, not every story is meant to be infinite. Some franchises falter not because they failed, but because they stayed too long. The courage Hollywood lacks is not the courage to reboot, it's the courage to stop. Franchise fatigue is the audience quietly saying, we remember why we love this, we just don't want to keep pretending. And when that moment arrives, no amount of erasure, rehab, or nostalgia can restore the magic, because the only thing more powerful than memory is knowing when to let it rest. In the end, the franchises that survive are not the ones that rewrite themselves endlessly, but the ones that know when to stop. Because memory, like storytelling itself, only matters when it is earned, and sometimes the most respectful act is letting the story end.